So let's just dive right in. So let's talk about the town's climate vulnerability assessment. A little background on this. We've been working on this for well over a decade. We've been largely kind of working on the mitigation side of the ledger, which mitigation really means what strategies can you employ as a community or as an organization or as an individual to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. And we've been working on that going back to 2006, 2007. Dave Roper, who's on this call, was one of the citizens who was truly instrumental in getting our town council to adopt a target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So hats off to you, Dave, for all of your early work on that. And in the years since then, we've been basically doing that work, developing a community-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory. These steps that are outlined here are the steps that are outlined by the Compact of Mayors, which is a Staff memory. And so at any rate, we've been working through these steps. But when we signed on to join the Compact of Mayors, we were just about done with completing the town's climate action plan, which was a mitigation-only strategy to look at all of the different facets that contribute greenhouse gas emissions to our community and what we could do to significantly reduce them, pretty much transitioning to a net zero community or 100% renewable community by 2050. Then we've sort of turned our attention after that towards the adaptation side of the ledger. So what I want to talk about is how these things are different. So I was talking about mitigation, reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. Your next step is to assess what is your degree of vulnerability in a changing climate, even if you do all of the things you say you're going to do to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. If you're just absolutely crushing it on the mitigation side of the ledger, you still will have climate vulnerability because there is a certain amount of climate vulnerability baked in. And once you figure that out, you need to turn your attention to, I know these are the ways that I'm vulnerable. Now, how can my community adapt and become resilient in the face of a changing climate? So hopefully that is clear. And then a little bit more explanation or background. Christy Straight, who is on the call here today, she is our region's hazard mitigation planner. And the work of assessing climate vulnerability draws upon that framework, where you are working to assess hazards, vulnerabilities, and risk. And I use this example of Pompeii because I think it's a quick shorthand for folks who don't live in that world of hazard mitigation planning to understand it. So we have the great good fortune of not having active volcanoes in our backyard. Nonetheless, we do have some environmental hazards that we contend with. As Christy well knows, she's been planning for years around some of the things that are common to our areas like flooding or landslides along steep slopes, high wind events, some of those sorts of things. But in the context of climate planning, we're looking specifically at hazards related to climate change. And so in this example, the hazard is the thing that does the damage, right? In this case, a volcano. And then the vulnerabilities are the who and the what in your community that receives that damage or is capable of being damaged. And then your risk is how do those two interrelate? What is the estimated degree of impact to facets of your community, people, services, facilities, structures, and then, but also weighed against how adaptable is your community to those hazards that might be coming your way. So looking at the hazards that relate to climate, my group, my advisory team, of which Christy was a part, we looked a lot at the available data and climate modeling for our region, not just our region, but also nationally, around temperature and precipitation. We found that there was pretty good data and modeling on these two elements, different ways that temperature shows up or precipitation shows up. A really precious little available. We have historical data on hurricanes, tornadoes, and severe wind, but the way those things work is they're just extraordinarily difficult to model for the future. About the best we can say about those is we think they will increase in a changing climate or become more volatile or less predictable. Same thing with this part of the column. We think that all of these things are likely to increase, but there's not really good modeling around it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't plan around it. It's just we have a hard time figuring out the degree, the severity, the predictability of these elements. Then we took a look at what are the community systems that we think might be at risk in a changing climate. And these are divided up into kind of 4 big buckets, which are people and community, things that fall within the sort of the category of natural systems, economy and employment, and infrastructure and basic services. And the work that we did, that our group did over the better part of a year, was to take a look at each one of these climate-related hazards and determine what do we know about, what can we anticipate about the frequency or the intensity of change over the next 50 to 100 years, and then what are they likely to impact. So some things sort of jump out more than others. This is just an example, it's not exhaustive, but for instance, we're taking a look at heat waves and what do we think that might impact. So clearly there's a human health and well-being impact. We think that might have a significant impact on forest or tree cover, but also in the example recently that came out of Texas and the Midwest is when there's an unseasonable weather impact that is like high heat or extreme cold. You know, the energy grid in some places is not set up to adapt to that or to manage that. So you can have grid instability, particularly if it's a pervasive, widespread problem across multiple states, as heat waves tend to be. So I also want to stop for a moment and talk about this factor, because when we're talking about vulnerabilities, not all people in the community are equally vulnerable. Some people are going to be impacted first and worst by climate change. And these are many of the factors that we already know make people more vulnerable in a changing climate. So, you know, the very young and the very old, I won't read all of these to you, but essentially these are people who have traditionally identified as marginalized or vulnerable. For the sake of how I'm framing the climate vulnerability assessment, I am referring to these folks as frontline communities because they are on the front line of a changing climate. And so anything we do as a community to develop adaptation and resiliency strategies puts these folks at the center to make sure that we're thinking about their needs first. Just want to put that right on out there. And then here is my climate vulnerability advisory team. And I have the incredible, great good fortune of having a major research university in my backyard, as well as practitioners in our community, like Christy, like our stormwater engineer, like our folks in our public works department, who bring a lot of experience and expertise to the table. So I was able to pull in folks with a lot of expertise in these specific categories, and they were a phenomenal team that assisted me. I also was able to draw upon, you know, the wealth of graduate student researchers. 2 groups in particular helped me devise a community engagement guidebook about how to engage the community around climate change with an equity lens, but also some really surprising findings. I had 3 Masters of Public Health students do their capstone project on identifying the climate-related public health impacts that we should be looking at. And some of these really surprised me, things I didn't know about, like how diabetes can make a person much more vulnerable to heat stress, just things I didn't know about. And also northward progression of disease vector insects that we don't typically think of having to deal with in this area. So those are all, and things that, you know, are even considered tropical diseases that we've never seen in Virginia are marching their way northward. It's anticipated by some measures that dengue fever will be in our region by 2085. So, you know, these are really significant things to think about. So the draft report, which is available on the town's website, very broadly anticipates, shocking no one, hotter summers, warmer winters, and changes to precipitation patterns. Of course, the report itself goes into much more detail. I'm going to just share some high-level highlights of that with you. So in the case of hotter summers, I think this is our most dramatic finding from the climate data and modeling. It shows that, you know, what we've all, those of us who've lived here a long time, you know, Blacksburg, Montgomery County, the New River Valley region is relatively temperate in terms of its summer temperature. So our historic average for the number of days per year above 90 degrees in Montgomery County has been about 4 to 5 days per year on average over the last, say, 60 years. What the modeling is telling us is that under a low emissions scenario by mid-century, that number is going to pretty significantly increase, right? And then even more of an increase under a high emissions scenario. By end of century, we also see a split between the low emissions and the high emissions scenario, but the high emission scenario is really quite an alarming increase and fundamentally changes our experience of summer and what that might mean for Blacksburg. So I think this was the most troubling and concerning finding from all of the data that we examined around that. Similarly, but perhaps not as dramatically, the impacts to winter. And maybe you don't like winter. I'm not a huge fan of winter and cold weather, but it serves a lot of purposes in our community. And so when we lose those cold temperatures in winter, that has impacts for public health, agriculture, forest, ecosystems. You know, certain disease vector insects can thrive if there aren't a certain number of freeze hours or freeze days. Similarly, fruit-bearing trees require a certain number of chill hours every year to produce fruit the following year. So it might seem great to have that. In some ways, there are some things like we may necessarily spend as much money on heating our homes, but we also have to think about how this could make us vulnerable. And then I'd say the least dramatic change, but also one to think about, are the changes to precipitation. As you can see here, there's not a huge anticipated outcome, but you know, a day with more than an inch of rain has the potential to cause significant flooding with risk to public safety, human health, buildings, infrastructure. So if you have, you know, go from 3.5 of those a year to 4.5 of those a year, that has a significant impact for areas where there is a heightened flood risk. And we do have some of those, not so much in Blacksburg, or there's a few places in Blacksburg that tend to flood, but this might be a bigger issue at the regional scale where we do have some areas with significant and persistent flood risk. But also, you know, it's important for us to take a look at what these changes might look like at the national scale. Things like flooding kind of have a hyperlocal effect, right? But when we're thinking about temperature and energy grid stability, or temperature and food production, hydrology, what does that look like beyond Blacksburg? Because these more diffuse impacts can affect us locally. We have to think about how to plan for that. So, you know, I don't have specific data to show with you, but this is the historical average, a low emission scenario by mid-century, and a high emission scenario by closer to end of century. And just visually, you can see that there's going to be a lot of significant warming, particularly, it's not happening consistently, it's mostly occurring across the South and Midwest, where we grow a lot of our food. Also, another question is, what does this potentially mean for population displacement? Will some of these areas become so unpleasant or so uninhabitable? Will we see a northward emigration, internal displacement, or just voluntary immigration of folks looking to live in more temperate regions? And then I'll just real quickly, here are some of the same findings for warmer winters. So, you know, we're losing some of that cold weather in areas, and thinking about the disease vector insects, invasive species moving northward, things like that. And then this one is interesting because it's you have some paradoxical anticipated impacts with precipitation. Some areas are getting drier. In fact, a lot of the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, this part of the Southwest is getting drier, even southern Florida. Then other areas, notably the Appalachian region, is getting a bit wetter. Parts of California are getting a bit wetter, and sort of, it looks like to me, West Texas, New Mexico. getting wetter. So thinking about how that's going to impact us in terms of food production, water availability, these national scale changes are things we should think about how to plan for locally. Pretty challenging, but I think we're willing to roll our sleeves and work on it. So with all of that data and modeling, what our team did was work to evaluate the level of risk and prioritize it. So we weighed essentially two things along two axes. What is the potential impact of the climate hazard, be it hotter summers, warmer winters, changes to precipitation? What is that impact from? Is it a low potential impact or a high potential impact? Where on that continuum? And then here are the factors that we use to come to that determination of low to high potential impact. And then what is our local adaptive capacity to mitigate or become more resilient in the face of those changes from high to low? And here are the factors that we weighed on that. And I know this is a lot to look at, but this is how that shook out. We took a look at each one of those critical community systems in areas where we might be vulnerable. And let's just take this one here, ecosystem services or forest and tree cover. We determined based on everything we knew and the available data to us that this has a high potential impact on our community, whereas we have a low potential to adapt to it. So things in this sort of upper right quadrant are the most concerning, and then these others that are more orange, some combination of sort of a medium to high level impact with a medium to low level adaptive capacity are also quite concerning. And then just looking at this gives you a quick snapshot of, it looks like in the case of hotter summers, our natural systems are most at risk, but also pretty significant concerns for people in community. Less so for economy, employment, and infrastructure and basic services. Not no concern, but just a little bit less concern. So we did this same risk prioritization across warmer winters, somewhat similar findings, largely impacts landing on natural systems, people in community, really very little on economy and infrastructure. And then similar findings for changing precipitation. Most of it's landing on natural systems and people. This one also has some significant potential to impact infrastructure and basic services. So great, what do we do about that? Where we've landed with this report is we haven't fleshed out concrete programs and policies. We're just pointing our community towards what we can do about it. So we've identified these anticipated impacts to people in community, in this case, reduced agricultural output, rising food prices, heat-related illness, quality of life impacts, those sorts of things. And then what do we do about it? So this is where we've landed, is pointing us towards the next piece of work, which is to potentially convene a climate food resiliency team for the region, develop a food resiliency plan. I'm currently working on that with some folks at Virginia Tech. The Center for Food Systems and Community Transformation is really excited to roll up their sleeves and work on that with me, or to develop a community heat action plan strategy and advocate for that to be adopted regionally. So that gives you a sense of the scale at which we're thinking right now. So again, we did this across the four major themes of the climate vulnerability assessment: hotter summers, warmer winters. Notably, there really wasn't much here that rose to a high priority level for these two. So we're focusing our efforts on people in community and natural systems. And similarly with changing precipitation patterns, this one, there wasn't pointing us towards needing to get real active on adaptation strategies. So this is where we've landed with that. So across the whole climate vulnerability report, where we have landed is these were the things that rose to the top time and again, whether it was hotter summers, warmer winters, changing precipitation. These were, kind of medium to high level risk across all three of those. So this is really where we're focusing our efforts going forward. So next steps. This is part of it. I'm engaging the community on the key findings of this report. also doing a fair amount of internal work within the town of Blacksburg, integrating some of these findings and proposed adaptation strategies, even though they're high level, into our comprehensive plan, which has recently just been finalized. Aligning our budgetary decision-making for infrastructure to better adapt to a changing climate. Been working with Christy on integrating these findings into her upcoming, or this, it's sort of imminent to kick off a major update of the regional hazard mitigation planning process. So I'm really happy to be a part of that work. And then getting more granular is to develop some policy development teams with that equity lens, thinking about those frontline communities on these primary themes of food resiliency and security, human health and well-being, biodiversity and ecosystems, largely probably focusing on farms and forests, and infrastructure and basic services. So that's again some outreach. Here's another way, if this is of interest to you. We have a community engagement platform that we launched largely because of COVID, because we couldn't do a lot of in-person, but we like it quite a bit. So we encourage you to go visit Let's Talk Blacksburg. You can just Google that, and it'll take you to this page where you can take a look at lots of different projects that the community is working on. So it's not just climate vulnerability, but it's all of these array of projects or policy themes that we're working on. We want to hear from our residents on that topic. And then within climate vulnerability, you can go in. I just wanted to give you a quick test drive through. It sort of shows you where we are in the process. So this sort of shows we're here. The vulnerability report is completed and released, and I'm sort of in process on forming those policy development teams, and with the ultimate goal of developing a climate adaptation and resiliency plan for our community. And you can go further into there and really get into some granular level detail. If biodiversity and ecosystems are the thing you're most concerned about, we want to hear from you. What do you think we can do to adapt and be more resilient? You can also download the full report there. And so with that, I will stop share and see if anyone has questions for me. And we may need to allow people, I don't know if folks can unmute themselves. Actually don't know how this is set up. I didn't set up this Zoom. Any questions?
It looks like people can unmute themselves.
Yeah, Denny, I just saw he unmuted himself. Denny, did you have a question for me?
Well, I just am pretty impressed with the work that you all have been doing. I mean, not just the work, but the way you've got your slides presented and whatnot. It's pretty amazing, really. So hats off to you and all the members of the folks that were involved or are involved in this work. It's pretty impressive, to say the least.
Thank you, Denny. Thank you for your kind words.
So how does a thing like a pandemic fit into this? How would that work?
Well, I think we've all learned that the pandemic has just made every problem that we have in our community more complicated to respond to. You know, I think about, I'm not necessarily drawing a line between the things that went down in Texas and the Midwest in February. You know, I think that the jury's still out on whether these polar vortex destabilization events that create these tremendous cold spells are or are not climate change related. But nevertheless, when you have a really significant weather event and you're also contending with a public health emergency, response is just that much more difficult. So you can imagine the same thing would be true for, you know, flooding events or extreme heat waves. And then you're also contending with, you know, an infectious disease. How do you shelter people? How do you evacuate people? All of those things are way, way harder if you're also contending with that.
Is there any place where this is the report is physically available, or or what's the easiest way to share it with others?
Yeah, it's not physically available, but of course you could certainly download the whole PDF and print it off. I tend to not want to put a lot of paper copies of stuff out in the community, just no reason to kill trees for no reason. And most folks read stuff like that online anyway. But Matt, if you want a physical copy, I will get you one.
Sometimes I might be the only person, but sometimes like the library, I will actually peruse what's laying about. They have a little section, I think, for things that can range anything from the property tax assessments to other little things going on around in the river valley or the town.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I should talk to Monina about that. I wonder if there are sort of like a local government section, things like that. I'd be happy to print one out for that purpose because it would, yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Lots of folks could take a look at that. I see a couple of questions that came in here. One from David Burke, I'll just read it. Thank you, Carol, for sharing this. How will these policy teams be structured? Made up of local experts, community members, town staff, and or elected officials? This is a fantastic question, David, because it's one of the things I'm wrestling with. When you are, when you have a commitment to doing equity-centered policy development, then those people need to be a key part of crafting adaptation and resiliency strategies. So, and I've been in conversations with the NAACP's Climate and Environmental Justice Committee, and they've expressed interest in joining in that work, as has Virginia Organizing. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they have both expressed interest. And so it's a mix of bringing in topic area experts and frontline communities who are likely to be hurt first and worst. So the policies we develop need to be centered around their needs. And so that, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's my intention on standing up those teams.
Yeah, that does answer the question. Thank you. And I'll just add this follow-up, which is, what do you hope, what would you like for each of us to do other than going to Let's Talk Blacksburg and engage there? What do you hope each of us as individuals will go do as a result of having heard this today?
I would say that I'm going to give you a little bit of a long-winded answer. While the town of Blacksburg is committed to developing its own adaptation and resiliency plan at the local level, particularly when we're looking at the much broader geographic impacts of climate change, Blacksburg can't come up with an adaptation strategy to deal with a grid that becomes destabilized, right? That needs to be a multi-state or national level policies. And so it's not a very satisfying answer, but I think that we all have a lot of competing urgent issues in front of us. I don't think that'll shock anyone on this call, that the world kind of seems like it's on fire, but keeping the pressure on to our state elected officials and and at the federal level to say, we really need a comprehensive climate change and adaptation and resiliency policy, and probably getting involved in state level politics and holding their feet to the fire is what's needed. I would say also, you know, advocating for this, if you aren't in Blacksburg, advocating for this work within other communities. If you're in Christiansburg, or, you know, I don't know if anybody on this call is from outside the region, ask if they're doing this work, because it gets a lot easier when more of us are doing it together. I'm part of a cohort of Virginia sustainability directors, and we are constantly in, you know, a community of practice and learning with each other. And so we're all engaged in the work, but it's about 15 localities in Virginia out of the hundreds of, you know, cities, towns, counties. So 15 communities doesn't move the needle much, even though they're big. You know, it's like Richmond, Alexandria, Arlington, Charlottesville, Roanoke, you know, the higher population centers. we need this to move out into the more rural and smaller communities as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Salesh, I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong. Any policies to promote green construction? Yes, that is something I'm working on. It's largely an outgrowth of the climate action plan, which is that mitigation plan to reduce greenhouse emissions. Something I'm working with the town manager's office is to advance a set of development incentives to integrate green building practices and affordable housing for future development. It's really hard, really tricky needles to thread. I won't get into all the reasons why. It's really challenging to figure out how to do that and come up with economically persuasive incentives for local developers, but that is something that we are doing. Green building is one of those great strategies, which is a win-win. It both reduces our greenhouse gas emissions because the buildings over their lifetime use far, far less energy, but a green building is also more resilient in a changing climate to high highs, low lows. They're just more efficient buildings. And so that's one of the no-brainer things that we want to do. And that's also a major state level policy issue. If folks don't know, our state level Department of Housing and Community Development sets the building code standard for the whole state. And the Home Builders Association of the state successfully lobbies every year to strip away their power to adopt the latest version of the International Building Code. They strip out the energy efficiency standards. And so that's a very specific way that you can get involved and hold lawmakers accountable and make sure that that discretion is returned, or not even discretion, that makes it mandatory for Department of Housing and Community Development to adopt the latest standard and for localities to have to promptly adopt that standard and not delay it by 3 or 4 or 5 years. We're still operating under the 2012 building standard, I believe. Like, it's laughable, right? Virginia is super behind on this. And it's because of bad lobbying. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Timelines for getting policy change in place. Is there anything happening in the next 5 years versus the next 15? Boy, Emily, you've asked a hard question. At the local level, I think that we have a lot of control over things like land use policy locally or budgetary decisions that we can make around infrastructure. I think that we can successfully make the case that we should be making rapid pivots towards, if we're putting in infrastructure that we anticipate will be in place for 75 years, we don't want to make a bad investment on that infrastructure if it's not going to withstand a changing climate. So that sort of hyper-local stuff, we can move on in the very near future. We're already making those changes where we have that flexibility, but where it requires state level enabling legislation, it's anybody's guess. We're seeing a lot of change at the state level. Seems like more and more lawmakers are taking climate change seriously. And then at the federal level, who the heck knows? So it depends on the policy you're talking about. Does that answer your question, Emily?
Yeah, I guess just within the town of Blacksburg, it's like creating the teams and things. I guess that's more of a question. Like, these are happening if teams are being made very soon. Like, how soon can we come up with these teams and then get those ideas, I guess, in place locally?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, it's anybody's guess, I guess.
It goes back to the strategy that you're talking about. So in the case of, like, let's say that we're concerned about hotter summers and drilling down to what would be the impact to a particularly vulnerable population, let's say older adults, let's say outdoor workers. That's a strategy we can move on in the very short term if we develop an engagement program for firms that have lots of outdoor workers, like construction, landscaping, that sort of thing. We can work with the health department to do some direct engagement on that, or through Warm Hearth or the AARP and we're actually already doing that work, right? But when it comes to some other policies like, shifting the building code, and that just by its nature takes longer, or transportation planning, things like that, or building infrastructure like cooling centers for folks, that just takes longer. So it's an unsatisfying answer. It super depends on the strategy you're looking at. David has a question about the plastic bag deposit. So this refers to enabling legislation that came down from the Virginia General Assembly in last year's session that enabled cities and counties to adopt a plastic bag deposit. I got with the town attorney and I said, so by cities and counties, they also meant towns, right? And he was like, nope, they super don't mean towns. So you can't do it, we can't do it. The county would have to adopt a county-wide plastic bag deposit. And so David asked what you can do locally. Get with the county administrator and the board of supervisors, because they're the ones with that power. The town can't independently do that. So I don't know if that answers your question, David. Oh, okay, there we go. It's there. All right, hit me. What else you got?
I had a comment on the number of rain events over an inch. And one thing to be cognizant of that is an inch of rain is not a big deal if it's spread over 24 hours. It's that can be viewed as beneficial, if anything. But a lot of times with this warmer and more humid climate that we're having, you get these storms. So in 20 minutes, you get an inch of rain, and those can cause a lot of problems. Especially since a lot of our engineered infrastructure is built on not having too many of these. So well pump stations and stuff can fail and stuff like that when you get these supercharged events, and they can cause all sorts of problems. And just anecdotally, I had my driveway redone this year, and both guys who I contacted with mentioned on their own that they've noticed more and stronger storms over, just the past few years that they've been working. So this is something that's truly is changing. And yeah, it's that massive impact of these storms that don't move and just, cause a flash flooding immediately.
That is such a great point, Matt. I'm glad you raised it, because that was, I wasn't able to get into that level of detail, but the folks on our advisory team that had specific expertise around hydrology and precipitation and a changing climate were making those exact same points. And one of the things that I didn't share that was also a finding is that we are modeled to get kind of this paradoxical increase of overall precipitation, but also an increase in the number of dry days, which doesn't sort of make sense, but she said, no, it actually does. What's happening is you'll have more, not necessarily a period that would rise to the level of drought, but certain number of dry days, and then these intense rain events. That's what's happening in a changing climate. So not only is it a lot of rain kind of suddenly all at once that can overwhelm the system, but if the ground is baked dry, you have even worse impacts, the potential for mudslides. The water doesn't really infiltrate. You can have a lot of erosion and sedimentation that affects the ecology of waterways. I mean, it can have really devastating impacts, even with some relatively small changes that we're looking to have here. So great point. Thank you for raising that, Matt. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not sure if it's directly related to policies, but it does related to everybody can do something for climate change. Now, I recently started biking around, and I noticed how great, the bike trails we have here in town. I really appreciate for the town who have done this over many years. So I appreciate that. So Carol, so on behalf of, the bikers, so thank you for doing that. But I also noticed that it's not well known to a lot of people that how great trail we have. how far you can go. And, you know, from where I live in Strobelsville, I can basically bike all the way to Christiansburg's Walmart, Home Depot. I didn't even know that until recently, because I have a bike now. I bike around and find out a lot of routes. And also, I also noticed from where I live, very close to the high school, for example, how quick it is to get to the high school. Again, you know, I didn't know that, because it's not just good for the environment. It's also actually can probably, if more people are biking, it's probably can make the traffic better, because Prices Fork can be very crowded sometimes. And many times it is the parents, you know, drop off kids and etc. So I'm just thinking, is there, you know, if the town can do a better job as marketing these trails, like even like the newsletter I get from the town from time to time, maybe you can just remind people saying, hey, the weather is good now, you know, go out biking and, you know, walking. Here is the link to the trail map, for example.
Yeah, so Sophia, I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to jump in because I have exciting news.
Okay.
So folks who may remember Bill Ellenbogen, who was absolutely instrumental in getting the Huckleberry constructed over 20 plus years, you know, and just the community owes him an enormous debt of gratitude. He recently retired from that position and turned that over to Beth Lohman. I think many of you know Beth. She's the new president, and one of the things that she has decided to do to this exact point is to get a regional trail map made. And that's a physical map.
Okay.
And it's the kind, if you've ever used an AT map, that kind that is like weatherproof and really kind of heavy duty backpack. And so she's been working with stakeholders across the region, including Jen Millian, who's on the call right now. She's the president of the New River Valley Bicycle Association. But you know, the counties, the county, Christiansburg, Virginia Tech, Blacksburg, the Forest Service, the you know, all these different community stakeholders. So she's developed this super regional map, not to include the whole New River Valley, but to show how, for instance, the Poverty Creek Trail System, the new Brush Mountain Trails, the Huckleberry, Deerfield, the private trail systems that exist in Heathwood, how they all interconnect. And those are going to be for sale for relatively cheap as a fundraiser to support the work of maintaining and expanding the Huckleberry. So that's going to be available at, I believe, Eastern Divide Brewery, I think Rising Silo, I think Walkabout Outfitters, I think East Coasters Bike Shop. Jen, am I missing any where that map is going to be available? I don't know if you're still listening.
Okay, that's great. And then I assume you're going to also have a link, some kind of a map on the town's website so people can link into it?
I don't have an answer for that. I think the answer is probably yes, but because they're doing it as a fundraiser to support the, that's a decision for the Friends of the Huckleberry, but at minimum, I think that map will be posted also a physical copy at Trailhead kiosks so the people can see it, because yeah, you're right. The maps have not shown, they might show a section and you might be aware of what's immediately around your home or your route, but you don't see the whole system, and the system's growing, right? We're adding more than 20 new miles of trail on the Brush Mountain properties over the next 2 years that connect to the Forest Service, the Huckleberry extension that goes through Price, you know, the Toms Creek Valley through Prices Fork. Yeah, it's all these pieces are getting connected, and so it's time.
That sounds very exciting. It's just to, you know, let the town know when they send out newsletters, they can, you know, incorporate those news to us too. You know, just telling people, okay, the Huckleberry Trail is expanding. We add a new trails here and there. I think people would be, if you kind of remind people, people will be thinking about it. Then probably more people will go walking and biking. You know, that's just what's, you know, I have in mind. So
I think that's a great idea, and I'm gonna get Beth on the horn and mention this to her. And Jen is listening. She says she doesn't have a mic on her computer right now, but Jen, we should get together and chat about how to at least point people toward where they can get one of those maps, because I can't wait to get my hands on. I have a draft copy in my office right now, but I want to get the nice one that's like you can't kill it even if you try version.
I know Anne put in the chat, but I would also encourage you to follow our Sustainable Blacksburg website and our Facebook posts, because they do promote those kinds of things as well.
okay, got it. Thank you.
For sure.
I've got a question related to that, just communication of existing resources. As an individual motivated to take action for climate, I have found my wife and I bought a new house in town, well, new to us, in town a couple of years ago, and I have found it just incredibly difficult to find resources out there to help me evaluate where I can find the most efficient appliances, things like energy efficient building standards, things like that that are just, I know already exist, but in some place that is easily accessible and easily digestible to a person who is not trained in reading building code, things like that. So I just wonder if you have any suggestions around resources that are already out there to help an individual, a homeowner, just be able to make informed decisions about things around the house with climate friendliness in mind.
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think, and we may have that, if we don't already have that as part of our 21 actions, we may want to build something like that. I know we have in past, we've collaborated with, there's a local firm called Energy Check. They are kind of a subsidiary of a builder that tends to build to a green building standard. And he also has, as a part of his business, a firm that does home energy evaluations and retrofits. We had partnered with them several times to try to get information out to the community and encourage people to do exactly all the things that you're talking about. And we found that folks just weren't that jazzed about energy. I mean, you are, but folks are just not as jazzed about energy efficiency. They really care when we put information out there about solar. But when we talk about, oh, it's time to replace your water heater, here are some really energy efficient options, crickets, like people just didn't care. But we do need to have those resources out there for folks for when they are ready to start thinking about that. And so, and maybe you and I should get together with some folks from Energy Check and build out a resource list.
Right, right. We do have that as one of our upcoming actions too. And as part of our Buy Smarter, we posted about the Energy Star, also the guidelines for, large home appliances and that sort of thing. Although whether or not that qualifies as easy to understand is something else. But we are trying to get that information out there. So please do check out our website, and we're doing daily Facebook posts related to each week's actions too. But we also welcome people who with knowledge to help build out some of those actions too. Like Brenda Springer has put together some great resources for this week's action to eat more sustainably. So, and Kat Woodson had put together some of the cutting your transportation footprint. So we definitely welcome people who have expertise in different areas to help us build out those actions.
And David, if you're interested, you asked specifically about green building standards. You're right, it's a really complex world. There's lots of different standards. I have a crosswalk document that does a comparison across all of the different green building systems, and kind of, I would say the short answer is, for the most part, Earthcraft seems to be the industry standard for residential. LEED seems to be the industry standard for commercial and institutional buildings, but there's lots out there. Some of them are a little more than greenwashing, to be honest. And I think we've all seen that with consumer products where they'll slap like natural or green on it or eco, and just, it's nothing, it's meaningless. So that's also something to be aware of. But I would say you probably can't go wrong with Earthcraft or LEED if that's of interest to you. Yeah,
well, I have some interest and training and time to offer in that area of like putting something like that together. Who should I contact to just kind of talk it over, see what we might be able to work on?
I would say Anne, yeah. And Anne, if you want to throw your email in the chat or message it to David, yeah, that would be lovely, because I think you're right. What it is it's a lot of, it's like drinking from a fire hose information. And where we struggle is where it's the stuff that's highly technical information that won't be accessible to the average person who's just wants to ask a simple question. Is like, how do we distill it down to, if you're thinking about buying a new home, building a new home, renovating your home, these are this is like the top 5 things you should be thinking about that have the greatest impact.
Kind of like your little chart with the quadrants of, does it make a difference? Can I do something about it or not? What's that high quadrant? What are those things?
Yeah, and I think sometimes folks focus a lot on like materials. They're like, oh, I'll get bamboo floors and that'll make my house green, when really it's the energy profile of your home and the distance of your home to where you go day to day that has the biggest impact, versus the material for your countertops, like that kind of thing that people tend to focus on when they think about green building. So
great, thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you, Nathan. Energy.gov is also a great online resource. And I wanted to shout out that Jen Million put in the chat a little farther up that if you're interested in that Friends of the Huckleberry Map project, she provided a link to it. And I think it also will beg you for money, but I think you can find out more about where that map is going to be found and the timeline for it. Okay. Anyone else? Oh, okay. Anne put in the email for any questions, issues, or suggestions.
I'll just bring, just because the audience is pretty good here, I just read in a little local paper in France about a project that they did of ditch your car for a month. And they provide, I can't remember if they provide some incentive, like, if you're one of the winners, you win something. But anyway, it was really neat what they did, interviewing people from very diverse backgrounds within the city and the surrounding communities about their experiences without a car for a month. And all they did, all the hurdles they ran into, all the benefits that they received from doing it. So I thought that would be a really great thing for Blacksburg. That has so many different kind of avenues for not using a car, to have a contest fun thing to, and then some follow-up with what people's experiences are with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the regional commission used to have something that they would, I think it was like Clean Commute Challenge or something like that. And I think just operationally it was difficult for them to sustain it, but there's always the potential to do that. I think unfortunately we're at the end of May, but May is a really great month to do that because it is bike month, right? Like National Bike Month is May. So something to think about. Jen, Christy, I see you.
Hey,
You can't escape me.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that. We couldn't do anything this past year because so much of our funding, to get into the weeds, comes from DRPT, and the state kind of dialed back on things that might imply safety where safety did not exist. But we are planning on bringing back our Ride Smart Challenge. We're trying to figure out if that's going to happen in fall or if it's going to happen next May, but we do try to gear it towards one of those seasons. And I think the fall works great because we typically end up doing it when the town is doing Sustainability Week.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we do have an app that gives us the capacity to do targeted challenge activities. So I would love to work with you all on figuring out something with Sustainable Blacksburg, the town, however we want to organize that, on doing a promotion like this. Try leaving your car at home for a month and, like do little mini contests, events, or, whatever makes sense to get people excited about it. Yeah, and then we can track real results too with this app.
I love that. I'm so on board, Christy. I'm crazy when the Ride Smart Challenge comes around. I get a little too into it, don't I?
It's exciting. How can you not?
I know a few people like Kat Woodson who are already doing completely without a car too, so they can offer the rest of us some advice.
Yep. Well, gang, it looks like we're at time. Unless anybody has a burning question, I've really appreciated all of your super thoughtful questions. If you have anything else that occurs to you, you can hit me up. My email, I made it really easy. It's just sustainability@blacksburg.gov. So if something occurs to you later, hit me up and I'll do my best.
Carol, I just wanted to jump in with one other thing related to the energy efficiency. We also had a suggestion to look at sustainability makeovers for low-income people. So we are working on that, and we would really welcome anybody who wants to join that effort. So you can also send to the email too if you're interested in working on that with us. We're hoping to start small, but maybe do something in the fall. Thank you, Carol. That was a really great program. And thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Nice to see some of the faces I haven't seen in a while. Okay, bye guys.